Hi guys, well here we are again on Wednesday Night Live, and I honestly can't believe that Dr. Chris Knobbe has come on to share his ideas with us. It's a real privilege for all of us to have this conversation. I'm really excited about it. So without further ado, and I've been given permission by the doctor to call him Chris, so that's quite nice for all of us. So Chris, welcome to our little show. Would you like to give us a wee bit about your background, particularly how you get into this space you're in now? I've heard it, but it's so amazing.
Oh, Jack. Okay, thank you for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure. And so, well, I'm a physician. I'm an ophthalmologist, an eye surgeon. I'm a medical doctor. I went down a traditional orthodox allopathic medical pathway. You know, I went to a traditional medical school here in Denver, Colorado. I graduated 30 years ago in 1990. Wow. And, you know, Jack, I'll just say that here, you know, my entire training and career up until about somewhere around 2007 to 2011, I didn't understand anything about nutrition, essentially. And what had happened, though, was, you know, because they don't teach any of this in traditional allopathic medical schools, they do to a degree in naturopathic medical schools, and maybe even in osteopathic medical schools, you know, to a degree. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't understand anything about nutrition. They don't teach that in medicine. You know, they just teach us essentially that heart disease and strokes and cancers and you know, autoimmune diseases, macular degeneration, all these things are just mostly part of we're just getting older, we're just aging and bad genetics, and yeah, it's not a good idea to eat a lot of food from, you know, fast food, but oh, there's just really not a strong connection. Is really kind of, I think, in a if I could put it all in just a few, you know, just a couple of sentences, that's kind of the way allopathic medical schools look at this. And so really my backstory is that when I was about as soon as I finished my residency training in ophthalmology in 1994, I think we started eating more healthy. And because I had more income, and, you know, we were just thinking that we, you know, we should eat more healthy. So I think we started eating a lot more spinach, for one thing. Anyway, but I started having arthritis that affected mostly my knees. And anyway, just long story short is that for approximately the next 21 years, this arthritis progressed, and severely so. And by, you know, 21 years later, I was, that was 2011, and I was 50 years old. And my arthritis was absolutely severe. And honestly, in my own mind, I just thought, I'm not sure I'm going to want to live more than maybe another decade, because the pain is too severe. And without getting into the details, I learned about the paleo diet. And by the way, I had seen at least 10 or 12 of my colleague physicians in all special, like family practice, internal medicine, orthopedic surgeons, rheumatologists, and eventually I was given a prescription in 2011 for colchicine, which I thought was going to be, you know, my saving grace. But the very next day after receiving this prescription, I heard about the paleo diet for the first time. Yeah. I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, I decided to do this test. I'm going to not take the medicine, because the medicine was going to take 2 to 3 weeks to even start kicking in, and it's an immunosuppressant. Yeah. And so instead, I I'd learned a little bit about the paleo diet. I spent a couple of hours researching it, and I was curious because it was said to be anti-inflammatory. And that's when my antennae went up. And so I eliminated, I really was skeptical because nothing else had worked, and realized I'd been suffering, you know, from around 20 years with this, and tried all kinds of things. But anyway, nobody had ever mentioned diet to me. But anyway, I eliminated grains and dairy, and within about 10 days, I was 80% better.
Wow.
But I don't think it was because I was eliminating dairy. I do think the grains had something to do with it. But that's just kind of the backstory, and it's not where I am today with this. But anyway, Jack, it was that this was a life transforming event for me, because it was so phenomenal that diet could have that kind of impact on something I'd suffered with for more than 2 decades, and so severely that I thought, I wouldn't want to live all that much longer because the pain was so severe. And yet, in a few days' time, I was dramatically better with a dietary change. And so what I did next was I got a hold of Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Answer. And that was in about May of 2011. And I read that book cover to cover. And for the first time, Jack, I understood that diet had everything to do with all of these, westernized diseases. Heart disease, strokes, hypertension, cancer, obesity, Alzheimer's, on and on. And anyway, and then what I did was, so I started digging into this for the next 2 years until like 2013. And I had learned a lot, but I was still deeply confused. Things didn't make sense, and I wasn't on board quite with the paleo. There was a lot of things that didn't quite fit for me, like the saturated fat issue. Why was it that, paleo was suggesting that saturated fat wasn't good, and, potatoes and grains might not be good, but we know that a lot of populations are consuming those, and healthfully so. And anyway, so I came across the work of Weston A. Price in 2013. Yeah. And for those who don't know, could I tell that?
Please do. Please tell us.
Okay. So in 2013, early 2013, I read Weston Price's book. And Weston Price, for those who don't know, was a highly accomplished scientist, researcher, and dentist who in the 1930s traveled the world evaluating people on 5 continents, hundreds of populations, hundreds of tribes and villages, and thousands of people as they transitioned from what he called native traditional diets to more westernized diets. And he defined westernized diets as diets that included additional sugars, refined white flour, sweets, confectionery, canned foods, and vegetable fats is what he called them. Now I'm gonna recharacterize that as, to make it a little simpler for people who don't know this story, is you can just really look at this as added sugars, refined white wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. Yeah. Those are really what make up man-made processed foods. Yeah. And here's what the problem with those is that they are, what Price knew was that they were nutrient deficient, that they didn't provide vitamins and minerals like native, traditional, healthy, whole foods would. Yeah. And so Price, he sent back thousands and thousands of samples of these foods from all around the world and had them analyzed. He worked with something like 100 different researchers and labs in the US, just an incredible, epic volume of research. But anyway, so he had all these diets analyzed. And what he found was that, first of all, these native traditional diets contain 10 times more fat-soluble vitamins, which is primarily A, D, and K2, 4 times more water-soluble vitamins, which is all the B vitamins and C, and 1.5 to 60 times more minerals than did the American diets of his day, 1930s.
Yep.
And we are far worse today in terms of processed food consumption than where we were in the 1930s. And so what Price understood was that, okay, I'm sorry, let me back up. So when people westernized, the more they westernized the diet, the more they developed diseases of civilization, which was essentially began with dental decay, like cavities and abscesses of the teeth, but then it was followed by arthritis and cancers and loss of immunity to infectious diseases like tuberculosis. And so anyway, and then what I would suggest is that, so Price, published his books in 1939 and 1945, and he had published a whole bunch of scientific papers in the 1930s, just an incredible amount of work that characterizes all of this. And I would say that since Price died in 1948, and I would say that since then, in these next, whatever that is, 70 years roughly, we've had thousands of studies that would collectively support Price's work. And what we would now understand is that not only the way I see it, just to put this in a very tight little nutshell for people to look at, is that these man-made processed foods, added sugars, refined wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats, those now occupy at least 63 to 72 or 75% of the American diet as of 2009. And so, and what that means is that, number one, is we are extraordinarily nutrient deficient, meaning we're not getting all those vitamins and minerals. But secondly, what Price didn't really have the capability to understand in 1939 and 1945, just shortly before his death, was the severe toxicity of these foods. And so the way I see it today, Jack, is that we have two massive problems when we consume man-made processed foods. And those problems are that we become nutrient deficient, we're missing vitamins and minerals, and you can't get those. It doesn't work to get those in pills. It just doesn't.
No.
And anyway, so we're nutrient deficient, and then we have this toxicity part of it. And the toxicity is driven primarily by seed oils, vegetable oils, trans fats, and the fructose component of sugar, or you could just say very high sugar diet. So you put those together and you have the recipe for disaster that will drive all of these chronic diseases again. And these would be things, let me just name these because I want to kind of hit these for people, but now that I see all this, and I've learned a lot about this in the last maybe 6 years, essentially, is that these diseases would be things like the big ones. They're heart disease, cancer, stroke, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, Alzheimer's, dementia, the autoimmune diseases, arthritis, age-related macular degeneration. Those would be some of the big ones. Now, there's a whole bunch more. There's a whole bunch more. Those are the big ones, though, that are going to capture a lot of the audience in terms of so many people are getting these diseases today. And these diseases were extraordinarily rare in the 19th century before we had all of these. And I can go back through that history if you want me to, but that's sort of the big picture and how I got into this. And let me tell you, if I could just mention, so I am an ophthalmologist, an eye surgeon, and what happened was that as I learned about this in 2013, it took me, after I read Lauren Cordain's book in about April or May of 2011, and then I read Weston Price's book in 2013, early 2013. And then honestly, I started digesting all this and ruminating and investigating. Yep. And then all of a sudden, late 2013, it hit me that possibly, because I'd always been interested in nutrition, but it hit me that possibly macular degeneration, age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 65 worldwide, yeah, that this might also be a disease driven by processed food consumption. And I had interviewed my patients for decades about their diets and their health. And I always connected this because I always had this interest in nutrition. I just didn't know anything about it until about 2011. But I always had an interest, mostly for my own sake and the sake of my family. And so I began to investigate that in 2013. And by February of 2015, I was convinced that I had enough evidence to support the hypothesis that age-related macular degeneration is being, or was being, driven by macular degeneration. And I left practice to pursue that full time. And so eventually, and I worked with another nutrition researcher and ophthalmologist in the South Pacific. And we published a paper in 2017 in the journal Medical Hypotheses. And we analyzed data in 25 nations regarding processed food consumption, yeah, and age-related macular degeneration. And I believe there is a strong correlation. There is extremely supportive evidence for that hypothesis. And so, but then I got really interested in the seed oils because I think they're massively important to all this chronic disease. And that's where I've actually been, I've been speaking on that and working on that a lot in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Chris, this is a really important moment, I think, for everyone, because when anyone comes across this movement, I'm going to call it a movement, right?
Yes.
Others call it that too. There comes a moment when you're confronted with the idea that saturated fat is actually good for you, and right, that vegetable oils and margarines are actually not. And what happened in the UK, I'm sure you know that UK kind of follows America anyway, but what happened here was there was huge campaigns, advertising campaigns around a margarine called Flora. It was we were just bombarded by the ads for it, how healthy it was, how heart healthy it was, and still doing it today, believe it or not. And we got sucked into this margarine thing. My mother would put, people remember this at my age group, stork on the table rather than butter. I remember flying not that long ago, first class with British Airways to America, and they served up margarine with the meal. And I said, look, can you not give me some butter? They had no butter on the plane. Right. This is first class, British Airways. I said, you must be joking. But nevertheless, they weren't. This is because they get caught up in this nonsense. So here's right, here's what I think is really important. When most of us come across the low carb thing or the keto thing or the new healthy eating, it's a real challenge to go over the fat thing. It's a real challenge to surrender and give away the margarine, to give away the seed oils, the gallons of sunflower oil and all the rest of it. What's going to be really important here is for you to share the story about the seed oils, I think, because I think I said this to you before we started. Look, guys, when I heard Chris being interviewed by Ivor, apart from all those illnesses, as already mentioned, we could fill flip chart pages of more, to be honest. And that's never before we get into mental illness. The thing is that when he explained this seed oil thing, went back through the history of disease, these big killers, he gives us permission to live. He gives us permission to live. He gives us permission to live as long as we can, as healthy as we can, both physically and mentally. And we've never had that permission before because we've always been told 1/3 would go with cancer, 1/3 would go with stroke, 1/3 would go with heart disease. What you're going to hear here is profound, and it's a doctor telling us, guys, it's not me or someone else, it's a doctor. So Chris, do you want to tell that seed thing? I know you're passionate about it, and I was wowed by your explanation with Ivan.
Yeah, sure. So I think the best way to look at this, Jack, with regard to heart disease, and then I can tell a little bit about the other, the history of some of these other diseases.
Please do, yeah.
And I think that it's so, I feel like in a podcast, it's really difficult to get into some of that deep science anyway. And so if
we probably wouldn't want to go there anyway. We'll just trust you.
It's so hard to do. It's hard enough to do with images and all that. When you get down to the molecular level, and honestly, this is one of the things that I have felt at times is that I've heard some other doctors say, and I won't even mention their names, but I like them, and they say, I don't care what the molecular pathway is. I just want to know what works, and that's really all that matters. The molecular, biochemistry detail, I don't need to know it. Well, I do need to know it because I have to convince my colleagues.
Yeah.
And so I do have to get into that. But here, let me give your audience some of this history, because I think it's shocking. So and I have to look at some of my notes because I don't have all of this in my head, but so I will look at a few notes here just so people know I'm not just, I don't have every bit of this in my head. But if you look at heart disease, it was an extraordinarily rare disorder in the 19th century. In fact, it was just virtually unknown. In 1811, for example, in the town of Boston, Massachusetts, they have a list of the mortality, all causes of death for all the people that died. It was like 942 deaths. There were no deaths listed related to heart disease. Now, they did have 25 sudden deaths. So if you counted all those as heart disease, and they weren't, but they were probably cardiac valvular, from syphilis, endocarditis, and what's the other one? Rheumatic fever. There we go. Yeah. Driving valvular disease. Anyway, those could cause sudden deaths. But anyway, so it was only 2.6% even had a sudden death. And we know that in the entire 19th century, there were only 8 papers reporting anything about coronary artery disease or coronary heart disease deaths in the entire 19th century. It was just, they did know about that there was a possibility for coronary thrombosis, a clot forming in an artery in the heart, and a death that would follow, but it was extraordinarily rare. For example, Sir William Osler, who's the famed physician who was one of the founding members of Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland, in the U.S. In 1897, he reported his previous 21 years of hospital experience, and he was aware of around a half a dozen cases of angina, chest pain that might be heart related. He'd never seen a heart attack.
Wow.
1897, never seen one. And then in 2010, 13 years later, 1910, 13 years later, he went to London and he gave a presentation, and he said that between 1897 and 1910, he had witnessed an additional 208 cases of angina. chest pain. He'd still never seen a heart attack. Jack, not one.
Wow.
Okay. And in fact, so if we go back a little bit to 1900, there was a paper by Jones and colleagues that came out in 2011, and they recorded that 12.5% of people in the US died of heart disease, but they know that it was all valvular disease. Again, that was endocarditis, rheumatic fever, and syphilis driving cardiac valvular disease.
That was at the turn of the 1900s?
This was 1900.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, 1912, John Herrick published the first known case of heart attack in the US, and they had autopsy evidence. Nobody really knew what it was. They didn't even take it seriously until about 1922 because they didn't know what heart attacks were. They didn't know what heart disease, coronary artery disease was, but yet in the 1930s, coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death in the US. And it followed soon thereafter in the UK. By the 1950s, coronary heart disease was the leading cause of death in the UK. But anyway, so whereas in 1900 we didn't even know what heart disease was almost anywhere in the world, by 2010 in the US, 32.3% of people are dying of heart disease. Like you said, it's 1 in 3.
Yeah.
All right. So, how do we account for that? Well, anyway, okay. So let me tell you real quickly, because I'll do this quickly. Cancer.
Yeah.
1811, cancer claimed 1 in 188 people. 1 in 188 deaths due to cancer. 1900, Jones paper from 2011 showed us that 5.8%, 1 in 17 people died of cancer in 1900. Today, it's 32% again, or 31.2. Anyway, it's almost 1 in 3 again.
Yeah.
All right. Type 2 diabetes, which runs with metabolic syndrome and obesity, they run hand in hand. Well, we know that in the 19th century, type 2 diabetes, or any diabetes, was extremely rare. By 1935, it was 0.37%. By 1960, it had elevated 2.5-fold to 0.91%. By 1991, in the US, it had increased to 2.97. That's an 8-fold increase. 2015, it was at 9.4%. That's a 25-fold increase in a period of 80 years with type 2 diabetes, right? So, okay, now obesity. So these researchers have done obesity analysis on prisoners in Texas and Nebraska, where they recorded their height and weight so they could get to their BMI. Right. And in the US, they know that in the 19th century, they tallied this up, and obesity was 1.2% for men age 18 to 80 in the 19th century. Right. So we think, we Americans, we think that we were super lean in 1960, but in 1960, obesity was already 13%. So between 1900 and 1960, obesity had already gone up 11-fold, right? Wow. Okay, so 1980, for example, obesity was still around 13%. 1988, 23%. 1999, 30.5%. 2015, 39.8%. And the latest study shows that we're on target we are expected to be at 50% or 49.7% obesity by 2030. Yeah. In the US.
And that's excluding pre-diabetes, presumably.
Yes. Excluding pre-diabetes. Wow. Oh, yes. Yeah, wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So, and then let me, since I'm, ophthalmologist, let me just hit macular degeneration just very quickly. So what I know is that, with all of the research that macular degeneration was discoverable in the 1850s, but it was extraordinarily rare between 1850s and 1930. And then it begins to elevate. And then we see that by 1975, for example, in the US, 8.8% of people over the age of 52, and 27.9% of those over the age of 75 had macular degeneration. So an extraordinary increase. So here's what I would say is that we've seen heart disease and macular degeneration, for example, rise thousands of fold since the 19th century. And we've seen cancer go from 1 in 188 deaths in 1811 to nearly 1 in 3 by 2010, basically a 200-year period. We've seen type 2 diabetes go up 25-fold in 80 years. We've seen obesity rise 33-fold in a period of 110 years, essentially, or 115 years. And so along with that, now here's what happened. So historically, what we see is that the world had virtually no vegetable oils until 1865, 66. They came from the good old US of A, is where they started, because so the first vegetable oil that was ever consumed, a high polyunsaturated vegetable oil, to my knowledge, that was ever consumed was cottonseed oil. And it was in the 1850s, cottonseed oil had previously been used for lamp oil and machine oil, and then they had used it as fertilizer, and then they put it into feed, and they fed it to cattle, and it didn't kill the cattle. So what they did was, in 1866, they started sneaking it into butter and lard.
Jeez.
They adulterated it. Nobody knew. They didn't know they were getting cottonseed oil, but these manufacturers started putting it in. The reason they did was because cottonseed was a byproduct of cotton production. And so they just had these, just masses of cottonseed, and they figured out how they could press it and squeeze it, and get the oil out of the cottonseed, which was otherwise a complete waste product, and they could produce this oil cheaply. And then they started adulterating it. And for example, in 1880, France made complaint to the US that they were receiving adulterated olive oil. And I think at that point, it was documented that about 40% of the olive oil was actually being adulterated with cottonseed oil. And so that's how it started, and it continues today. But basically, so the vegetable oil consumption was really low between about 1866 and 1909, and then we got soybean oil, and then these just took off, and the edible oil industry was developed. And the whole reason for it was because of the fact that these oils could be produced and sold much, much more inexpensively than butter and lard. And so they were mostly putting this in butter and lard, adulterating it.
Yeah.
And, people either didn't know or they didn't care. And then eventually they were told it was okay. And so what we see is that, so here's what I could tell you, is that in 1865, essentially for 99.9% of the world, nobody had ever consumed a vegetable oil, ever, anywhere.
Yeah.
And so consumption was 0 grams per person per day in 1865. By 1909, I think I've got the data here. Yeah. So by 1909, we were consuming about 2% of our calories as vegetable oil, or omega-6 oil, okay? 1909. This continually rises, and so by 1999, we're at 7% of our calories in the US, in just omega-6 linoleic acid, just the one fatty acid from vegetable oils that's an omega-6. And by 2008, that was 11.8% of our calories. So let me just tell you that we'll go back to just the one linoleic acid, which is the primary 18 carbon omega-6 fat, which is about 80% of our omega-6 consumption. Our omega-6 would have been in the US 2.2 grams a day in 1865. We've calculated this. In 1909, we're at 4.84 grams a day. By 1999, we're at 18 grams a day. And by 2008, we're at 29 grams a day. And so, you know, we just see this massive increase. So that is a 12-fold increase in our consumption of omega-6 fat in just one molecule, linoleic acid. We're not counting all the others, which would add additional to that. And that's a huge problem because we accumulate these fatty acids in our membranes and in our cells, that we don't burn them for fuel properly, we accumulate them. Yeah. And so what we see is that this creates a pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, and toxic biologic milieu that is driving a whole lot of this disease. Now, let me go back to, okay, so let's talk about sugar, refined wheat flour, and the trans fats real quick. So sugar, we know that, because these are the other commodities, essentially, that are part of this big picture. So sugar, we consumed about 6 pounds per person per day in 1822. By 1990,
6 pounds per year, not per day.
Oh, 6 pounds per year. Yeah, per person per year. Yeah. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And then by 1999, we're at 108 pounds per person per year, which was a 17-fold increase. Now, sugar is a nutrient deficient food. And again, it's the fructose part of that, which is half of it, at those levels becomes toxic. Yeah. But sugar consumption, you know, has just gone kind of like vegetable oils. Refined white wheat flour was first introduced in 1880 because of roller mill technology. Well, roller mill could remove the bran and the germ of the wheat, and that's where the B vitamins, E vitamins, fiber, minerals, omega-3 and omega-6 fats are. And now people wanted refined white wheat flour, but refined white wheat flour is a nutrient deficient food. And so today in the US, we know Lauren Cordain's group showed that in the US that the grains recently, I think it was 2003, were about 85% refined. Yep. So that's about 17% of our diet. So here's how, and then trans fats, that came with Crisco. And what that was is that was introduced in 1909 by Procter & Gamble with their product Crisco. And what that was and is it's a vegetable oil. They started with cottonseed oil, and you bubble hydrogen gas through it in the presence of a nickel catalyst or copper, possibly, to produce these trans fats, which are semi-solid, and they're extraordinarily dangerous, as you know. So anyway, so those became part of margarines. Yeah. and Crisco and these cooking fats. And so anyway, you put all those together, and that is processed food. It's sugar, refined flours, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And as you know, I'll just say, you know, Lauren Cordain said this a long time ago, you know, that if you call it a cookie, call it pizza, call it a Pop-Tart, but it's made of those same things: vegetable oils, sugars, refined flours, yeah. and trans fats. That's basically what you can make. You make hundreds of thousands of foods, is what big food manufacturers do, out of those 4 components. And that is, you know, essentially what we see driving, you know, the huge bulk of all of this disease.
Yeah, I heard you say probably 80% of the disease that we're dying of is coming from this source, yeah?
I honestly, Jack, I think it's around, personally, I think it's 96%, maybe 97%.
There you go. There you go.
I mean, it's just a guess, but I think it is massively important.
So here's a doctor, okay, and you've put all this work in, you've understood it. Presumably, you do not have vegetable oils on your table in your cooking, but you will presumably entertain yourself with saturated fat from time to time, yeah?
Yes.
And you
Oh,
know,
no. I think saturated fat is extremely healthy. We need it. That is the fat that we should be looking to get. Okay, so this is a good place for me to talk about populations consuming saturated fat. Would
yes,
it be?
please do. Because
Okay.
I love the stuff about the Maasai and all that. I had the privilege of being out in it with the Maasai and doing my stuff out in the plains and talking to the guys. It was amazing, and watching what they eat.
Yeah.
So I love how you portray this. So
Okay, yeah. So this actually was one of the things that I that I read in 2007. It was an article, I think, in Men's Health. That's where I was getting my science at that point, right? A magazine, and it was by Nina Teicholz.
yes,
And anyway, I think she honestly kind of followed the coattails of some of the work done by Gary Taubes
yeah,
on this. But anyway, the Maasai. So I read this article in 2007, and it was all about the fact that the Maasai, who are living off of milk, meat, and blood, the Maasai, for those who don't know, are a pastoralist tribe. They are cattle herders, and their diet is made up of almost exclusively milk, meat, and blood. That's what they live off of. They get almost no fruit or vegetables, hardly ever. The huge part of their diet is the milk, because they don't sacrifice their animals very often.
no,
And then they bleed the animals on occasion and add that to the milk.
yep,
And anyway, but the Maasai, so George Mann, Mann, and colleagues studied the Maasai extensively and published a paper in 1972. And here's what they found. The Maasai warriors, the typical Maasai, were consuming about 3,000 calories a day. 66% of that was coming from animal fat. 66%. And if you look at it there, and that the saturated fat in these healthy cows grazing on grass is hugely saturated. So it's about 30% of that is saturated fat, which means that the Maasai warriors' diet is upwards of 45% saturated fat, but it's somewhere between 33 and 45% saturated fat. Now, the American Heart Association maintains today, still, they say, saturated fat elevates cholesterol, cholesterol kills you, and so don't consume more than 5 to 6% of your calories as saturated fat. Consume these vegetable oils, right? Because vegetable oils drive your cholesterol down, and indeed they do. And we can talk about that. But, okay, so the Maasai, so they examine the Maasai. They do 50 autopsies, 25 of whom were over the age of 40, I believe. Not a single heart attack. Not one. All right. They examine 350 Maasai warriors who are over the age of 40, I believe it was. And out of all of those, they detected one possible heart attack on EKG evidence. And that, I believe, could have been a silent heart attack. Now, there's other reasons for heart attacks, which I don't want to go into necessarily, but like sickle cell, for example, can drive heart disease, sickle cell disease. But anyway, so one possible heart attack in their entire population, and I think that was a silent heart attack. So this is a population consuming 66% of their calories as animal fat, which is about 30% saturated fat, no heart disease. These guys are lean, fantastically lean, healthy. I mean, who wouldn't want to look like them? And they had no obesity, they had no diabetes. I mean, this wasn't all, but you could look at them and basically tell they're just, I think cancers were almost unknown. All right. How about the Tokelauans? So in the South Pacific Island, the Tokelauans on the island of Tokelau, their native traditional diet was studied extensively back in the 1970s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. and their diet was mostly based on the coconut. And in fact, they were getting around, I think it was 63% of their diet came from coconut oil, which is a highly saturated fat.
Exactly.
It's about 89 to 94% saturated, I believe, if I remember right. And anyway, so if you calculate their saturated fat consumption, it's right at about 48% of their calories coming from saturated fat. So while the Maasai warriors, the Maasai tribe, has the highest saturated animal fat consumption in the world as far as we know, and has no heart disease, the Tokelauans have the highest saturated fat consumption in the world as far as I'm aware of, and I don't think there's any other published evidence to suggest otherwise. Virtually half of their diet coming from saturated fat, 48%. And guess what? They had no heart disease.
Yeah.
They had no obesity, no type 2 diabetes, no metabolic syndrome. Cancer was virtually unknown. They're extraordinarily healthy people, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, those are two populations that just, if you look at that, you know, what I thought even in 2007, when I first read the story about the Maasai, I thought, we've been duped. We've been fed a lie. We
Absolutely.
Physicians in medical school, you know, all they tell you is saturated fat raises cholesterol and cholesterol is a killer. And we know that's not true.
Yeah.
There is, you know, you can look at all these studies and there's almost no correlation between total cholesterol and heart disease whatsoever. There's a very strong correlation between oxidized LDL and heart disease, a very strong correlation. And how do we get oxidized LDL? We get it from vegetable oils. In fact, you measure oxidized LDL by the presence of malondialdehyde, MDA, and 9 and 13 HOD primarily. HOD is hydroxyoctadecadienoic acid. I'll never say that again, Jack.
Please don't.
But these are what are called advanced lipid oxidation end products, or ALES, ALES for short. And these advanced lipid oxidation end products, these ALES, come from vegetable oils primarily. So it's very interesting. Yeah. But you can, but LDL, we know LDL, oxidized LDL, is mechanistically driving atherosclerosis, driving the development of the atherosclerotic plaques. So it initiates it, it drives it, and you know, we understand the mechanism, and we see that oxidized LDL has an extraordinary correlation to heart disease and stroke and all of that. But that's kind of the big picture there too.
Yeah, I mean, for 30 years, I do all the cooking. I buy all the food. I do the cooking for, you know, for the family and everything all through my history. And I was buying gallons of these oils, thinking they were safe, you know.
Of vegetable oils?
Yeah, gallons of the stuff. Going through it, you know, bottles of every month, cooking, frying, you know, the whole thing, baking, believing all of it. And here we are. But look, I'm aware of the time, and I want to see if I can get you to talk about a couple of things that might be important to us. We got into this, we got into this series of videos, and we're following coincidence that's led us to your good self. What's your take on maximizing your ability to withstand COVID if should it ever come into the realm of your life? Because it's obviously out there and may come again, and or if we don't get this one, there could be COVID in 2021 and so on. What's given the kind of circles you move in? I know you travel all around the world and you speak at the conference, you're on the big circuits. What are you picking up that you would advise our group just to be aware of? And then maybe a wee bit about longevity, what you're maybe doing yourself, what you would recommend.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I will tell you, Jack, and your audience, I have zero fear about COVID. I mean, zero. Okay, maybe I'm an extremist and people might think, oh boy, you know, what's this guy about? I don't want to wear a mask anywhere. I'm forced to, but here's why I have almost zero concern about COVID for myself, whatever, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
is because I know that, for example, in my own life, since I changed my diet since 2011, I've been sick 3 times. I did get the flu once, and on the second day of the flu, I spent the better part of that day in bed, and it was the mildest case I've ever had. But I used to get, before 2011, when I was consuming a standard American diet, I got sick. I took antibiotics 6, 7, 8 times a year.
Wow.
Because I got sick every 4 to 6 weeks. I would come down with a bug, and now I can't hardly get sick, no matter what. I don't have any fear of being around any sick people whatsoever. And here, it all goes back to, you know, really what Weston Price showed, for example, with tuberculosis. The people that followed native traditional diets, they didn't get tuberculosis.
No.
They didn't get infectious disease,
No.
essentially. And that's what we know is when you have a nutrient dense diet with those, you know, the coming from the fat soluble vitamins, the water soluble vitamins, all the minerals, if you do that and you eat things like liver, fish eggs are really good, or a good quality, cold extracted, extra virgin type of cod liver oil, which gives you vitamins A and D.
Yeah.
You consume real pastured butter, pastured eggs, things like that that are going to give you these vitamins.
Yeah.
You will create a very powerful immune system that will prevent you from it'll prevent you from getting the infections, and if you get them, that you probably won't even know you had it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
See,
the huge majority of healthy people that are getting coronavirus, they don't even know they had it. And so I may have already had it. I don't care.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. Before you go on, I suddenly realized there was something I wanted you to say for the audience in case we miss it. And it's why, with everything else you said on Iris, it just blew me away, was this thing that's got nothing to do with genes, or it's got very little to do with your genes. This idea that you're going to have heart attack, or you're going to have a stroke, or you're going to have cancer because in your genes going back. You kind of exploded that, and I was like, again, that's where I felt you gave us permission to live. Yeah, because there's no real evidence. When you go back in that historical stuff, it points to the fact that our forefathers and mothers who had our genes weren't getting ill. So why would we get ill because of our genes? But anyway, can you say something about that quickly, because that was really powerful?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just give it in a very quick nutshell. Here's the thing. It is impossible for epidemics, pandemics of disease like heart disease, cancers, strokes, hypertension, diabetes, obesity. None of this could possibly be driven by genetics. Why? Because our genes have not changed in thousands of years. And in fact, you know, the evolutionary biologists will tell you that our genetic makeup is 99.9 something% the same as it was 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
So I did the math, and it's like, you know, the possibility for our genetic makeup to have changed in a century is like 0.00000, you know, 9%. It's so incredibly small. Now you can change your epigenetics. Epigenetics is the way that nutrients allow or induce genes to operate. And that is what you change. And you can change that today with your nutrients or lack thereof. You will modify the way your genes are going to pump out proteins that they're made to make. But you're not changing your DNA makeup in that way, not without a permanent mutation. All right. So that's So what I'm saying is that heart disease, all these diseases can't possibly be driven by genetics when our genetics haven't changed. And we know that, as I reviewed a century or so ago, all these diseases were extraordinary rarities. Does that answer the question in a nutshell?
Yeah, yeah. It's just a point, I suppose, that because of this pressure coming about, you die of heart disease, or you die of a stroke, or you die of cancer, one third, a little bit in between, you
Right.
might know it. And then the whole thing about, well, my grandfather died of one, or some myth in the family that you're running this gene that you're going to die of a heart attack. It's nonsense, isn't it? And that's the point. It's nonsense.
It's absolutely nonsense. Here's what I would say, Jack, is, what you inherit from your parents is the way they eat.
Yes.
That's what you inherit.
Yeah.
Because they teach you how to eat, and a lot of the people, they say what they do, and they're led to believe this by their own physicians, is they're told, yes, well, gosh, my dad died of a heart attack, so I'm gonna get my dad had type 2 diabetes, therefore.
Yeah.
And there is no question, I will admit, everybody has a susceptibility to different diseases. You and I could eat the same westernized diet with vegetable oils and sugars and trans fats, and maybe, Jack, you might get cancer, and if you and I eat the exact same thing for 40 years, I get a heart attack, or I have a stroke, or both, right? Or I get macular degeneration. But and another person eats the exact same thing, and they get an autoimmune disease like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah.
So we all react different, because that's what happens is the diet drives you towards your own susceptibilities, and we all have genetic susceptibilities to different things.
Yeah.
I'm very susceptible to arthritis. That was my thing.
Yeah.
That's my issue.
Yeah.
But that's what it's about.
Fantastic. So just finally, because I'm aware of the time going on, it flies by always.
Yes.
Is the thing about longevity, looking out to the future, what would you recommend people do to kind of maximize the potential of their health for living a ripe old age healthily right up to the final days,
Yes. It is exactly what we're already talking about. You have to eliminate all man-made processed foods, is what I would suggest, as much as you possibly can. You need to cook. You need to make almost all of your own food.
Yeah.
It's a pain, I admit. And then you need to be extremely cautious if you eat out or eat elsewhere, that you're not getting vegetable oils. That would be the main thing. That's the main thing to be extremely cautious of. If they're cooking in an oil, have your food cooked in butter, real butter, if at all possible. Do that. And then it's the typical things: don't smoke, exercise, those kinds of things. But in a nutshell, again, to keep it simple, it's a healthy lifestyle. Get enough sleep, get your exercise, and then adopt this way of eating. But I tell you what, you can look people had extreme stress in the 19th century, and a lot of them lived to ripe old ages because they were consuming native traditional diets. And that's something that we haven't had time to get into. But I will say this real quick, Jack, is one of the arguments people will make is they will say, well, the average age of death in 1900 was only 49. Everybody got old and they died in their, by the time they were 50. And that is so fantastically absurd. But the reason that it is the reason that the life expectancy was so low 100 and 200 years ago, which it was, is because of the fact that mostly huge numbers of children died in childhood. In the year 1800, 43% of the world's children did not live to see their 5th birthday. In 1900, it wasn't much better. 36.2% of the world's children did not live to see their 5th birthday, and 4% of women died in childbirth in 1900. And so right there, you can see that drops the average age life expectancy down dramatically. So I always say, if a man, husband and wife, a man lives to be 80 and his wife lives to be 70, but their child dies in infancy, which is extremely common, 100 and 200 years ago, the average age of those three is, I mean, if the sum total is 150 divided by 3, it's 50.
Yeah.
And that's what happened for huge numbers of most of the world. And for example, I don't know if I have that data handy, but in the UK, do I have a minute, Jack?
Well, we'll take all the time you'll give us.
Okay, so in the UK, specifically England and Wales, in 1891, 63% of the population was still alive at age 50. 43% was still alive at age 70. 6% was still alive at age 90. In 1911, in England and Wales, 71% of the population was still alive at age 50. 51% still alive at age 70. 10% still alive at age 90. This was in 1911.
Yeah.
Right? But the thing is around 20-some% of their children in 1911, and I don't have that data handy, would have died before their 5th birthday.
Yeah.
Even in Sweden, which is where they had the lowest mortality in childhood in 1900, and I think it was 22% of their children died before their 5th birthday in 1900. Yeah. So I've got all kinds of data that supports that, but I mean, for example, the first 8 U.S. presidents, and the last one died in the the first 8, the last one died, Martin Van Buren, I believe it was, died in 1846, 1850-ish. Their average age of death was 79.4. But if you look at all the presidents in the U.S. that have died in the 20th century, their average age of death was 75 point something. And I excluded John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated. So all the others virtually all of them died of chronic disease, like heart attacks and strokes and cancer and all that kind of thing. So the first 8 U.S. presidents outlived all of the presidents in the 20th century by around 4 years.
My goodness.
What does that tell you? But that was typical. If you survived past age 15 in the 19th century, you were likely to live a long life, just like we do today, for the most part. Wow. They just succumbed to infectious disease. Tuberculosis and pneumonia and GI infections killed almost everybody. That was the major causes of death back then.
Yeah. So just occurs to me quickly, in your own profession, in your own sphere of where you've taken your work, have you been able to, I mean, one of the great things about the sort of low carb keto thing is people reversing out of these chronic diseases and giving up their pharmaceuticals and stuff. Have you made progress with the eye in terms of disease and having people get better by changing diet, so on?
Yes, I only have anecdotal evidence so far. We don't have a formal study. And these diseases that like heart disease and stroke, Alzheimer's, and macular degeneration, it takes decades to get these diseases while consuming westernized diets, right? Yeah. And so, in other words, you don't see hardly anybody get them until they're 40 or older. So it takes decades to get them. And so the changes are slow. And all I have with macular degeneration, I've got now 4 years of evidence from a lot of people reporting back to me that their macular degeneration, almost all of them report that their macular degeneration has stabilized.
Fantastic.
That stabilized, and some of them have reported reversal and improvement in vision. But in general, I would say that the huge bulk of them are reporting to me via, this is all via email mostly. People keep in touch and they say, my macular degeneration has just stopped because they went to an ancestral, I call it an ancestral diet when you eliminate those processed foods, and they have stopped the progression. And that is not what we would see scientifically. Just as Ivor Cummins will tell you that the research will suggest that heart disease should just keep progressing, right? And you'll see progression of the atherosclerotic plaques. The coronary artery calcium scan is going to get worse by 15% per year or whatever. Yeah. And we know now, of course, that stops. Ivor has helped teach the world that, right? Yeah. That when you see people stop sugar, refined flours, vegetable oils, they stop the processed foods, they stop the progression of their heart disease, and those people, their risk goes back, I mean, in terms of having an event, as he has explained to us, goes back to almost the same as a person who has no heart disease at all. Yeah. The risk of having an event like a heart attack or, those kind of things.
So Chris, how do people follow you? How do they keep in touch with you? How do we do that?
So you can come to our website. So I work for Cure AMD, which stands for Age-Related Macular Degeneration, but it's Cure AMD Foundation. Yeah. It's at cureamd.org, and they can go to the contact form there. It's under About. They go to the contact form and they can email me directly. That's the easiest way. I mean, you can find my presentations on YouTube. Yeah. All over the place. It's Chris Knobbe, Knobbe. And if you go on YouTube, you can look there. I've got some videos and I've got a lot of free information. I don't earn anything. I don't accept any compensation for what I do, Jack. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I just feel like what I need to do is spread this message, and I believe now we've reached over 1 million people with this message about macular degeneration. So I think perhaps tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people's lives may be different, and we're preventing vision loss through this, this pathway, this message. And that's all I want to do. I want to spread this message. So when your people go there, and now they can support us, we rely exclusively on charitable contributions, but I don't receive anything, as I said. Sure. So I don't accept anything from that. We just use any funds to help offset our costs of running this organization. Good man,
Chris. Well, I can't thank you enough. I know everybody's going to love this when they get to watch it. It's been fantastic. Your passion for it is just wonderful. I wish you every success, everything you're doing, and it would be nice one day if I can see you on a stage somewhere. You never know, I might get to a conference.
That would be great, Jack. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate you sharing this with your audience. Yeah, we might make some differences in people's lives, and that's the cool part.
Yeah, that's it. Just want to help people find a brighter future. Yeah,
absolutely.
Cheers, buddy. Well, listen, thanks again.
Cheers, Jack. Thank you.
Okay, cheers now. Bye-bye.